Welcome, everyone. We're going to begin now to the Adapt and Rebuild Organizational Renovation on the Road to Recovery webinar. So just some housekeeping issues. We will mute everyone for the period of the webinar, but feel free to type in any of your comments, any of your questions in the chat box. We've got Ana Sofia and myself on hand to respond in real time, and we'll queue up some of those questions for our speaker, Lee, as we go forward. And I did just want to mention that this webinar will be recorded for communication purposes. So just to begin, I would like to acknowledge that where I work in Mcconnell Foundation, we are based in Montreal, which is on the traditional territory of the Mohawk people, which is a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst various nations. Where I'm joining from today is in Takaranto in Turtle Island. This is the traditional territory of the Mohawk, of the Mississaugas, of the Credit, of the Anishinaabe, of the Chippewa, of the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I'm joining in from Dish with One Spoon territory, which is an agreement made between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee, which is serving to protect this land and recognizing that we all eat with one spoon from one bowl and must ensure that that bowl is never empty and that there's no knives at the table, meaning that there's a real shared responsibility to care for the land and the creatures within it to keep the peace. And of course, now this land, and I'm sure the land that you are joining from, are home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So for those a little bit less familiar with Mcconnell Foundation, it is an 80-year-old national family foundation. It has major initiatives that is all serving to build a more inclusive, sustainable, resilient, and innovative country. And reconciliation is a core facet of our work, social innovation is as well. And what we've recognized alongside our responsive granting work, there's a need for capacity building as well. And so Innoweave is an initiative of Mcconnell Foundation, and Innoweave helps organizations and collaboratives innovate. So there's 11 or so different modules around adopting social innovation approaches. And so what we're trying to do is make these social innovation approaches practical, accessible, and useful to expand and enhance your work. So the goals for this particular session is to help organizations prepare to rebuild with practical financial forecasting tools. So we want to introduce some approaches to help you analyze the financial implications of your rebuild strategies. So if you recall the last webinar that we did on June 26th, it was really kind of setting the landscape as to what ideas and what changes may be required in your organization. And this is the follow-up to that, which is really helping you analyze the financial implications of that. And so we would also like to then end the webinar towards the end, sharing or reminding you of some of the different supports available that might be useful in your next steps. So the intended audience for this webinar is that organizations without a senior financial manager on staff or that are considering one or more of any of the following rebuild strategies, be that starting up a new program in a particular impact area that you've discovered new customer or beneficiary needs in, or maybe you've seen an existing program that is operating and that's working, and another organization is maybe struggling to keep that program alive, and so that you can acquire it from that organization. Or maybe you have an existing program that has historically been effective, but needs to undergo some sort of delivery, transformation, or change in order to meet the new realities that we find ourselves in. Or maybe there's a program that has become either difficult to sustain or otherwise less relevant in our times today, and so you want to exit that program. So there's lots of program changes that you might be undergoing, and this webinar will hopefully help serve you and help you understand the financial implications of that. When it comes to thinking about your asset base, so perhaps you're expecting or potentially pursuing the receipt of a donated property or purchasing a property or otherwise selling or disposing of property. And that could be equipment, it could be land, it could be buildings. And so this webinar is also hopefully hopefully going to serve you to think about the financial implications of any of those changes. And we're going to briefly mention about mergers and amalgamations, but we're not going to go too deep. And so if that's an area that is of interest to any of you, please do express that in the chat or in the feedback forms that we'll send you later on, because there are going to be additional tools upcoming. So just to begin, it would be really helpful just to understand what are the strategies that you are each thinking about for your organization. So I'll just run a quick poll. And I'll give you a minute or so to just respond to that poll. And basically it's asking, from that list that I just kind of went through, what might apply or what might resonate for you in your organizations? So I'll give you about 40 seconds left. Go ahead and choose any of those that apply for your organization. All right, I see a lot of organizations are really thinking about delivery transformation, and that makes a lot of sense given the adaptations that are required of us in these times. And I see a lot of program startups. So, potentially organizations are really responding to emergent and new needs of their beneficiaries, of your customers. I see some organizations are needing to exit and potentially looking to purchase a property. There's actually a healthy interest in mergers, and so that's interesting to see, and hopefully we can serve you well soon. So I'll just give you just 10 more seconds, get your last votes in, Ken.
And maybe while people finish filling out the poll, I'll just take a quick second to introduce myself. My name is Ana Sofia. I'm joining from Montreal. I'm also part of the Innoweave team, and I've been participating in the implementation of our new stream Leading Through Crisis, so through which this webinar is being offered. And I just wanted to reiterate for people just joining us that we will be monitoring the chat for any questions that you may have. And there will be a time later on for people who prefer to voice those questions to ask those. So thank you everyone for joining, and over to you, Wayne.
Thank you so much, Ana Sofia. All right, so I'm going to share those results for everyone to see. So you can see certainly lots of organizations thinking about delivery transformation and program startup. And I see Sandra is adding in comments of some of the, just provide some more color for the other, specifying what other meant. And for Sandra, it meant shifting in model to create more impact in our sector. So that's great. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so without then further ado, whoops, can I get that off my screen? I'd like to just introduce our presenter for the meat of our webinar today. Lee Heron joins us from Victoria in BC, a member of Scale Collaborative and highly experienced in nonprofits, both from a executive director role, as well as being on the board of directors of many organizations. And as you'll see, he has a lot of experience in a number of those different changes that your organization might be going through, and is very skilled at sort of presenting financial models in an easily digestible way that boards can get their heads around, that other team members and your management team and your volunteer team perhaps might need to get their heads around as well. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Lee.
Okay, thanks, Wayne. We're just gonna do a hot swap here of the screens, and the closed captioning still, oh, it is still going. Excellent. Okay. I just need to get over here. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge as well, at Scale Collaborative here in Victoria, BC, we live and work on unceded Coast Salish territories, specifically of the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples. This photo is of a Gary Oak meadow in spring, which is a rare ecosystem that characterizes this region. My name is Lee Heron, and I'm with Scale Collaborative. We're based in Victoria, as I said, and we are taking an ecosystem approach to support social enterprise, social procurement, social finance, and social innovation in Victoria and across Vancouver Island. Previously, I was the executive director of an enterprising neighborhood-serving organization here in Victoria. I've also served most of my adult life on boards of directors. And in that time, I've had a lot of experience with organizational renovations, most of which, but not all of which, were successful. But in all of those renovations, I played a key role in evaluating them, both from a programmatic perspective and from a financial perspective. Today's session is going to focus on evaluating organizational renovations financially, and hopefully I will provide some easy-to-use tools to help you quickly evaluate potential renovations. Let's first spend a little time, though, thinking about the big picture of why our organizations need to adapt and the challenges that any organizational change poses to the organization's leaders. Early on in the pandemic, we developed a tool for organizations facing uncertainty, especially about future cash flows. That recording is still available on the Innoweave site, and if part of your interest in today's session is looking for a way to manage uncertainty about your financial future, then you might wish to view that webinar as well, and I'm sure Wayne can share that link. At the time, we pointed out that although it is always challenging to be a leader, it's much easier to be a leader in times of abundance and certainty. The crisis of the pandemic has revealed both previously unknown organizational strengths, but also some weaknesses. And perhaps it has accelerated the need for us to change. Hence the question of organizational renovation. I just want to stress that the concept of a renovation implies change, and that change can be both disruptive and emotionally challenging, and that it always implies some measure of risk. Today's session is about assessing the financial impacts, but not necessarily the human impacts. It's the human impacts that can trip us up, though, as well, and they always need to be considered before undertaking any organizational renovation. I don't want to dwell on the negative, though. Most of the time, organizational renovations are an opportunity to improve service to the community, to create increased impact, to better take care of the people we work with and for, and to financially strengthen our organizations in the future. To the extent that the pandemic is forcing us to reevaluate all of our activities, it may ultimately lead to a more resilient impact sector over the medium term. Before we dive into financial modeling, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of adaptability. Being adaptable means continuously making adjustments to fit the environment. Of course, we can never be certain about what the future may bring, and the pandemic has certainly shown that. But we can evaluate any changes to the extent that they increase our resilience, no matter what the future may bring. To this extent, smaller and more frequent renovations, even continuous renovation, may be a better adaptive strategy than infrequent, larger scale, and for that reason, riskier organizational changes. Many of you will have seen this model of the adaptive cycle before from Francis Wesley at the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience. The model is a Mobius strip that's right in the middle there. You can start where you find yourself, but will always progress over time through a predictable series of states and changes. Today, I want to use this model to briefly describe how this session will help you. For most of us, unless we were already in crisis before the pandemic hit, the time leading up to the pandemic represented some form of organizational maturity. We were managing the day-to-day. We might have had plans for the future, but we were planning to take those actions in our own time. Then the pandemic came and revealed for many of us a compelling need to adapt and change. And the acute nature of the crisis was such that many of us have found it easier to let go of the way things were in order to move into the adaptation phase, because lots of other things were already changing, and in many cases our organizational future was at risk. But now we are hopeful that the acute stage of the crisis is over. Hopefully, we've had some room to breathe, to reflect, and to begin to investigate possibilities about a new potential future for our organizations. And so, if we have settled on a set of possible changes, today we are calling them renovations, it is time to take action. But it's not always easy to move from possibility to action. In particular, we have to overcome the natural barrier of our reluctance to invest, particularly if that investment implies risk. By definition, resources are not unlimited, either financial resources, emotional energy, or physical effort. To commit our resources now means they are not necessarily available for something else later. Today's session will help organizations be able to assess whether the financial investments will make our organization stronger financially in the future to help us move from possibility to action. Day to day, in our organizations, we can't live without these basic financial functions: handling cash and taking money to the bank, paying amounts we owe, collecting amounts that are due, paying our staff, keeping financial records. And in larger, more sophisticated organizations, we require these additional functions as well: the ability to plan for the future financially, to hold ourselves to the plan, and to share information about our performance with our board and external stakeholders. In my experience, though, where smaller organizations struggle is here, with decision support, evaluating possible different courses of action and selecting the best one. Again, money isn't the only consideration in choosing to undertake an organizational renovation, but it is important that our choices as leaders financially strengthen our organization over the longer term. If they don't, we are potentially diminishing our organizational resilience when the next crisis arrives. I want to be very clear that any organizational renovation implies some level of risk, and there are professionals who specialize in helping your organization evaluate, avoid, and mitigate risks. I am not by training or education one of those professionals. However, I have been a manager and an organizational leader for over 20 years, and so I do have some experience. The discussion that follows and the tools I'm providing here are intended to help you evaluate decisions carefully from a financial perspective. But please do get your own independent advice before proceeding with the renovation project if you consider it to be at all risky. Now, let's spend a little time thinking about the reasons for an organizational renovation and the things we should consider and the challenges we might face. Again, in the spirit of continuous adaptation, what are some of the signs you might observe that prompt you to think in terms of organizational renovation? Perhaps you have evaluated your services and come to realize that the old way of doing things no longer works. This can happen if program attendance or participation is declining, but also if the program is too successful and outgrows your current space or staffing, or the community need outstrips the ability to meet that need with the current funding model. Alternatively, if you have recently shifted your vision and mission, some of your current activities may no longer fit, and you can only free up resources to focus on new goals and objectives by shedding some current activities. Often, we see programs and the overhead dollars associated with them as a means to fund core expenses. More programs means more resources to support the core. Or sometimes, perhaps a neighboring organization or a partner is looking to shed one of their programs, or a funder is opening up a new funding stream. So far, we've been talking about programs and activities, but the same opportunity exists with respect to program space, whether you own it or lease it. As your organization grows or contracts, you may need more space, or maybe you need less, or you may have space that is underutilized part of the time. If you can consolidate, perhaps there is an opportunity to generate some cash that could be redeployed toward other organizational priorities, and so on. Regardless of the need that was the impetus for change, the high-level goals of organizational renovation are generally the same. Ideally, we want to increase our income and our cash flows to ensure that our organization is more self-reliant and resilient financially. We want to strengthen and support our people, whether staff or volunteers. We want to build goodwill and support in our broader community and show our funders and supporters that we are serving the community and strengthening our organization at the same time. And of course, none of this should come at the expense of our quality and standards. Much of the time, these goals are easier to achieve with an expansion or an acquisition, but they can equally be the goals of a contraction, exit, asset disposal, or a merger between organizations. And so as we proceed, we need to contemplate the risks and implications of any renovation. Again, this isn't a webinar on change management, but it is important to think through any organizational renovation from all perspectives before proceeding. Typically, new acquisitions, whether programs or assets, require some upfront investment of both cash and effort. As well, most acquisitions have some element of risk. However, they all imply a certain amount of change, and change requires management attention. It is important to plan for this. On the flip side, exiting a program will impact staff and volunteers, even if everyone is retained. This also requires significant management attention. Exiting a program or disposing of an asset also affects the program's beneficiaries, and full consideration needs to be made as to how to prevent negative outcomes. Any change may be perceived as positive or negative, but it always requires communication, both internal and external. Always give thought to who needs to know what and when, and ensure that you have adequate resources and time to properly communicate. And lastly, realize that the board and the organization's leaders cannot focus on everything at once. Focusing on a change effort means other areas will not receive the same level of attention. This too is something to plan for, to avoid having your organizational renovation create more challenges than it resolves. I'm not meaning to scare you. Quite the contrary. We need to keep investing in our organizations in order to maintain the highest value to the community in the long term. The goal here is to provide some confidence that the risks of investing in an organizational renovation effort outweigh the risks of not investing. In all, we've created 4 specific tools. 1 tool to evaluate program changes, 2 tools to evaluate the acquisition or disposal of a piece of property, although I noted that nobody's intending to dispose of a property on today's call, and 1 to evaluate a merger between organizations. Please remember, these are financial modeling tools and they are simple to use. All of these cases have many considerations other than just the financial, but it is often uncertainty about financial outcomes that stops us from taking action. The rest of this webinar outlines a specific case and provides an overview of one of the tools. The pre-recorded webinars walk you through the specifics of using each of the tools for each possible case. Unfortunately, in order to do financial modeling, we can't escape some financial concepts. Your organizational financial statements have at least 2 main statements, but possibly 3 or more depending on the complexity of your organization. The statement of financial position, also known as the balance sheet, is a snapshot of your organization's assets, liabilities, and net assets at a specific point in time, usually your financial year end. To measure the impact of an organizational renovation, especially with respect to property acquisition or disposal, we can take a snapshot before the renovation and after the renovation to see if we are better off financially because of the renovation. The statement of operations, also known as the income statement, measures revenues, expenses, and net income or loss for a given period in time. Again, we can assess net income for a known period prior to the renovation and forecast the net income after the renovation to see if we are better off financially. In order to keep this manageable, we're not going to discuss the statement of cash flows. However, if your organization is cash constrained, or if the size of your renovation is significant relative to the amount of cash you have available, you should engage additional support to model the timing of the flows of cash, when it will be needed and when it will be returned. You don't want your organization to find itself short of cash midway through your renovation, even if the long-term benefits are significant. The overall modeling exercise works by starting with your financial position from your most recent financial statements and your organizational budget from the year. From there, we can flesh out the details of a program or asset change in terms of investment and in terms of operations. We can then see and present the results in a summary sheet. Remember, though, that this is a tool for roughly calculating the before and after. For complex or risky transactions, the next step would be to refine these estimates with further due diligence, including possibly getting professional or outside help. For now, I'm just going to demonstrate a simple use case for the program tool to give you a feel for how the tools work, and then we'll have some time for questions. Again, the additional pre-recorded videos give much more detailed instructions and examples of additional uses for the tools. So if you're interested in using a particular tool, I would urge you to watch the appropriate recorded webinar as well. Now, we're ready to move into the financial modeling. Let's start with the program tool. This is the financial position sheet. When we're modeling the acquisition of a new program, the most important questions with respect to financial position typically revolve around startup costs and the use of those funds to acquire things or to do work that will be expensed versus the use of those funds to acquire capital items, for instance, furniture, equipment, computers, to make leasehold improvements, and so on. Note that this tool does not assume you will use short or long-term debt to start up a program. If you are planning to use debt to start up a program, please let us know and we can either provide additional support or perhaps provide an additional tool. When you use the sheet, you'll note that all of the cells except those in green are locked. This is to prevent inexperienced Excel users from inadvertently overwriting a formula. We start from our most recent balance sheet and input our assets and liabilities. Your balance sheet probably has more categories than this, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we have simplified it to cash, other current assets, and long-term assets. And we have further subdivided current assets into unrestricted and restricted. In some cases, our organizations may have restricted cash that we can access for the purposes of program or property acquisition. Let's go ahead and put in some data. In this case, we'll model a small family service organization that we'll call XYZ Family Services that has the opportunity to increase its contract by offering service at a new site in a neighboring community. We changed the name of the organization at the top and added the data from our current balance sheet. For this exercise, we're using round figures, but you would use accurate numbers. As you can see, this is a modest organization with $250,000 of assets, $50,000 of liabilities, and $200,000 of net assets. So let's move on to inputting our startup assumptions. In this particular case, we'll assume that our funder is offering us $5,000 towards startup costs at the new location. This temporarily increases our restricted cash, but we will use it to invest in the program startup. Next, we need to create an overall budget for the startup activities. Here, we need to think about things we will need to purchase or do in order to start on day one versus things we will need to pay for on an ongoing basis once the program is up and running. Investments prior to the commencement of the program are startup costs and require cash up front, even if we later earn that cash back through positive margins. In this case, we assumed that we would need $6,000 for startup costs, of which $2,000 would be for materials and supplies, and $4,000 would be for capital items, for instance, a computer, some storage, furniture, and so on. We've also assumed that we will use, all of the $5,000 in startup funds from the funder to pay for this. The sheet then calculates that we will need to invest a further $1,000 of our own funds to make up the startup budget. You can see, though, that the outcome of this investment so far is positive. We have added $4,000 of long-term assets for $1,000 of our own cash after the investment from the funder. As such, in the bottom corner there, you can see that our equity has increased by $3,000. So far, so good, or rather our net assets there. Now, depending on how your organization does its budgeting, the next step may be more challenging. In order to understand the impact of a new or expanded program on our operations, we need to assess the impact of the new revenues against the changes in the cost items that it will require in order to deliver the program. Please note that some funders permit a certain level of administration charges, usually in the range of 15% of the total contract value. This is not what we are trying to model here. Rather, we are trying to assess the impact on costs of adding additional activity and/or additional locations, quite apart from what the funder will allow us to retain to offset overheads. Overall, the sheet is divided into revenues and 3 categories of expenses: program expenses, location expenses, and administration expenses. To get started, you'll need your organizational budget for the year. For the revenues, we don't need to model all of your organization's revenues, just the pieces that are going to change. This organization has a $500,000 annual budget, of which $48,000 supports the program we have been asked to expand, and roughly $2,000 in donations is collected in support of that program. And there are $450,000 you can see in other revenues that support other activities. For program expenses, we need to do our best to isolate all direct program expenditures that support all of our programs, including the program that is going to be expanded. In this case, you can see that $325,000 is spent on program expenses, mostly staff wages. For location expenses, we need to do our best to isolate the costs of our space, In this case, you can see that $41,000 is spent on location expenses, mostly rent for our office and program delivery space. Moving down the sheet, we need to do our best to isolate, we'll then come to administrative expenses, where we capture all of the expenses that support program delivery, but that are not direct program or space costs. In this case, you can see that $134,000 is budgeted for administration, mostly for wages. However, that $134,000 on a total budget of $500,000 is 26.8% of revenues. And this is a very high level of overhead, but it is hard to manage with less, especially in a relatively small organization such as this one. Last but not least, in this particular case, you can see that the organization's budget is balanced with no surplus. So let's model the impact of expanding the family support program to a new site. Because we are adding a new site, we will be using the Add Expand program column. In this example, we won't be using the Eliminate Reduce program column, but if you watch the video on program use cases, you will see how that column is used when reducing a program or exiting a program. And you'll also be able to see, and I noted that in the poll, there was a particular interest in program transformation. Transformation may mean shifting costs around. It may mean there's some new revenue or potentially some lost revenue. It may mean there's some new costs, but also some reduced costs in other areas. And the program transformation case you'll see uses both the Add and Expand and the Eliminate and Reduce program column in order to model the outcome of program transformation. In terms of the changes then, our funder has offered $40,000 of annual operating revenue to support this program expansion. We input that $40,000 in the Add Expand program column. We are also estimating conservatively that we can attract $1,000 in additional donations this year to support a new location. You can see that the sheet automatically calculates our new organizational revenues with these changes. Working from our program budget then, we input our budget estimates for direct program costs, again, mostly staff wages. Given that this is at another location, we have also allowed a little extra for transportation, assuming that staff will travel between the sites. We then input the estimated cost for the new location. We were able to negotiate the use of a multi-purpose space in a community facility, which helped keep the costs down for the additional location. But since we will be storing some equipment and materials there, we have also added an additional location on our insurance policy. The good news is that our administrative expenses do not increase much at all. After increasing our insurance policy for the additional activities, we feel we are able to manage the additional administrative work associated with this program expansion without adding any additional costs. In short, we are making more fulsome utilization of our existing investment in administrative infrastructure and support. This leaves us with a modest surplus of $5,750 after budgeting for the changes in revenue and expense. Of course, this is not how we would report this to the funder. Rather, we would show an administrative charge of 15% or $6,000 or specific allowances for administrative costs up to the amount permitted in the contract. This would put program costs to $40,750 in the funding report against a program budget, including the $1,000 in donations, of $41,000. The surplus in our funding report would be $250, which we fundraised ourselves. From the funder's point of view, this program is in balance, but for our organization, it's a great addition. We've increased service to the community. We've been able to offer our staff more program hours. We created a small surplus in our budget, and we added $3,000 of net assets. Of course, the increased service to the community and the staff with increased hours don't show up in this analysis, but the financial results do. Adding this program will increase our financial resilience and modestly increase our capital assets at a total investment by us of only $1,000. This summary sheet, this is the summary sheet now, can be shared with anyone in your organization who needs to understand or participate in the decision-making process. So obviously, that's a simplistic example, but I hope that it does give a sense of how you might use this tool to financially model the impacts of adding or expanding a program. But before we move to questions, I just want to mention a few important caveats. Firstly, we have not modeled cash flow. In this example, the organization had abundant cash relative to the risk of this program. But if your organization is cash constrained, you might wish to model the timing of the flows of cash more closely to ensure you will not run short. Secondly, startup costs for non-capital items will actually show up as expenses in the first year, and the money you receive to pay for those expenses will show up as revenue. However, the goal of this is not to precisely model the final income statement or balance sheet, but rather to show the ongoing financial impact on your organization. Thirdly, depending on how much your program relies on long-term assets, in other words, capital assets that depreciate through time, you may find that the results vary after your accountant does the books and makes an allowance for the depreciation of long-term assets. Fourthly, this tool assumes a full year of change when adding or expanding the program. If you are expanding the program midway through the year or acquiring a new program partway through the year, you could estimate the first year financial impact by only using partial year figures. Lastly, this tool models only 1 year of financial impacts and does not account for inflation. A great challenge that many of us face is that funders do not necessarily increase funding amounts annually to adjust for inflation, and yet all of our costs increase. Please bear this in mind before designing a program with margins that are too slim. Having said all that, I hope these tools are useful. They're designed to help you move beyond the trap of not investing, but are hopefully not so complex that you get stuck overanalyzing. They provide a first cut, and if it looks good, you can always refine more precisely and/or get professional outside help with complex or riskier renovations. If it doesn't look good at the first cut, then at least you haven't spent a lot of time and resources on a more detailed analysis. But no matter what size of renovation you're considering, please be sure to do your due diligence first and to get independent advice as required. Here are the links to the tools in the webinars. They are, the instructional videos are on the right there, and the links to the locked Microsoft Excel files for you to use are in the middle there. We're still in the process of building out a webinar and tool to support organizations contemplating a merger, and I saw there were a few organizations who were contemplating that in the initial poll. If you think that would be useful for you, please let us know, and that's something that we're continuing to work on. In closing, right now, as we enter the rebuilding phase of this crisis, many of us are being forced to adapt. And in some cases, the changes are unwelcome and will negatively impact our clients or our staff. And the changes may also have a negative financial impact. In other cases, however, we're being forced to contemplate changes that perhaps we should have made a long time ago, using Zoom, for instance. But for whatever reason, we had just not gotten started. Change is always hard. It takes planning, it can disturb or shift established patterns, and it can introduce risks. Of course, not adapting brings a different set of risks. And in the longer term, I wonder whether we will see that organizations who have been forced to adapt by the pandemic, who undertake some organizational renovations now, will become more open to adapting and renovating in the future in response to much less trying circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, for a very informative walkthrough and introduction to these approaches and to these tools. I'm going to take back the screen and just wrap it all up for us. Okay. So, just to segue into a poll, given that we've talked a little bit about the use cases and an introduction to the tool, and now just to get our own minds thinking about, well, what might be useful in our organizations, here's a second poll about what next steps might be useful for you. So this poll is asking about, well, which financial planning tools that we've just walked through or that we've introduced might be useful to support your decision-making in your organization. So might that be the program tool to model a program startup, an expansion or acquisition, delivery transformation of a program, the exit of a program perhaps, Might it be the property acquisition tool, so that you might be modeling a donated property or purchase of a property? Might it be the property disposal tool to model the sale or disposal of an asset, of a property? Again, it could be equipment or land or building. Might be the merger tool that, once it's available. Perhaps none of the above might apply, and that's also okay, or maybe others. And if you do had another financial planning tool that you were hoping for that you didn't quite see today, please let us know in the chat box, and we might be able to find it, or otherwise, we can see about getting you access to something that would serve you well. So I'll just give you another 20 seconds. Go ahead and select all that might be applicable for you in your next steps. Okay, so I'm going to just end this poll. I can share the results, and it looks like, a lot of us are sort of leaning towards using that program tool. So that will certainly be shared with you in a follow-up email right after this webinar. And it looks like the merger tool has some interest, as well as the property acquisition tool has a lot of interest as well. So thank you so much for sharing. And just as a last note, here's a few resources. Most of you are likely familiar with these, but just in case you are not, here's the information that would be pertinent for you. There's been a lot of COVID-19 response funding through the government, through partners such as Community Foundations of Canada, through different foundations, different funding agencies. And here's what's available and open even as of today. So many have opened and closed, but here's what's still available. There's the Resilient Community Fund, and this is led through Ontario Trillium Foundation. This is a one-time fund to support the nonprofit sector to really recover and rebuild. So as you're thinking about your rebuild strategies, as you've modeled the financial impacts of those strategies, you may now need to apply for grants to support the evolution of those strategies and the execution of those strategies. So this Resilient Communities Fund may be for you if you are within Ontario. For Indigenous individuals and organizations, so either an Indigenous-led organization or an Indigenous serving organization, for anywhere in Canada, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund might be right for you. And this is funded through a consortium of different partners, philanthropic sources. There are, I can't recall how many, a handful of regional relief and recovery funds ultimately led through the federal government, but administered through the regional development agencies. All the terms vary slightly regionally, and so the ultimate purpose here is to mitigate any financial pressure and support the recovery of organizations. And just note, this includes small businesses, even medium and businesses, in addition to nonprofits, charities, co-ops, and other social purpose enterprises. And last but not least, United Way has a regional response as well, and so you may want to check in with your local United Way office as well. And so that will be the end of our formal content and presentation here today. So thank you all so much for participating. Feel free to email us at Innoweave, so info@innoweave.ca, or Lee Heron directly at lheron@scalecollaborative.ca. And we'd be happy to take any questions or if you just wish to connect. But right now we do have some time. And so we'll just open it up to Q&A. Feel free to raise your hand if you know that function in the participants box in Zoom, or just unmute yourself and we'll do our best to coordinate so that it's one question at a time. Thank you all so much. Okay, so it just took me a minute to bring up the chat box, but I see some questions and some thanks. So I think Bo is requesting for examples of how to shift measuring successes and evaluating program efficacy in light of the current situations. Perhaps a slightly different question than the topic at hand, but I know Lee and Scale Collaborative, you do a lot of work in various different areas. Do you do any work in impact measurement and program evaluation?
We haven't done a huge amount of it yet, although we do have a program or a project underway rather as part of the Coastal Community Social Procurement Initiative to measure the efficacy of mainly at this point municipal, but also other large institutional purchaser, the efficacy of their social procurement efforts. Having said that, the first half of my career was spent at the BC Stats department, BC Stats, BC Statistics. I was the director of surveys and analysis, and we did program evaluation as well as performance measurement for public sector organizations. I've, to be modest, forgotten more about measurement issues than most people will ever know. And I've tried to forget, but if you have a specific measurement challenge, I'm probably able to help you or at least give you advice on who might help you.
Sure, thank you, Lee. It's a kind offer. And as well, Bo, Innoweave does have a entirely separate stream from the one that we're in right now, which is wholly about developmental evaluation and another one on impact measurement. So maybe Ana Sofia, if you don't mind kind of scraping up those links and posting it into the chat box. So that would be the DE and impact measurement streams. Oh, and I see many thanks to Lee for a fantastic presentation and very practical tools and recommendations given past engagements with Lee. So thank you all, Frank and David, for sharing that, and April and Pam as well. I see a question from Tina. Will Innoweave be able to financially support the investigation of org renovations? So some of the supports that are still available from Innoweave include our micro coaching offers. So if you go on innoweave.ca, you will note which coaches are available for micro coaching. And if you have a short-term engagement, something such as a quick hour call or just a short coaching engagement that you might need to talk through something or use an experienced coach as a sounding board. Some of those supports are available, and what Innoweave has done is sort of cut through a lot of the process and red tape, not really red tape, but you don't need to necessarily apply through Innoweave as we would traditionally have done. We have pre-approved a certain budget to those coaches so that they can just quickly respond to organizational needs given the times that we're in.
I see an interesting question there from Janice, and my advice, Janice, would be that's one of those cases where engaging your professional support is probably the right decision. Yeah, the tools that I've provided are not to help you determine a valuation of an asset or a right to use an asset. That's why there are accountants, and presumably they know all the standards and tools to use in order to do that. Sorry, I can't help.
Thanks for your question, Janice. Great. Are there any additional questions? Feel free at this time. You can unmute yourself and voice the question if you prefer, or feel free to continue to use the chat box to type in your question, and we will do our best to respond as we can. And thank you so much, Ana Sofia. Ana Sofia is sharing those links now in the chat box. And all of the different resources and links that we've been referring to today will be mentioned in the follow-up email to this as well. So if you can't quite grab it in the chat box, fear not, it will be in an email.
On the last screen there, it does provide my email address, and it's also in the instructions page of the tools as well. I do welcome any feedback, and I am one of the Innoweave micro coaches. So if you do need some support or advice in using the tools or thinking through a potential renovation program, I'm happy to set up a time to meet with you to discuss that. I will be on vacation for 2 weeks from this Friday until Labor Day, but I will respond to your note if I'm away and just let you know when I'll be back, and hopefully we could connect then. But like I say, I welcome feedback. This has been a great opportunity working with Wayne and the Innoweave team, and obviously they've expressed some confidence in scale, and we really appreciate that. But it's been an interesting opportunity for me to think through my own experience of having undertaken each of these types of renovations and how I thought about it at the time, and then to build the tool that I should have had at the time in order to properly evaluate it. And so it's been great to put my experience to work, if only after the fact.
It's been an immense pleasure collaborating with you, Lee, and with Scale Collaborative. So thank you so much for this amazing presentation and for capturing all of that experience in the form of these tools, so that, you know, I guess crudely we can all learn from without potentially repeating any mistakes that you might have made.
There's been a few, definitely been a few. I'm even candid about that in one of the other webinars, and so please don't. Well, actually, in both of them. So there's 2 or 3 successes in each webinar and 1 mistake. But it's a mistake that, had we had the modeling tools and thought through the modeling fully at the time, we might have been able to avoid. And in one case, with the property disposal, things didn't go our way, and we ended up needing to sell a piece of property. But the modeling that we did really helped us make that decision confidently.
Right.
And so, yeah, I hope that everybody's able to take advantage and find some use in these.
Terrific. Yeah, I think it will be the case given the responses in the chat box. And I do see a question from Peter Miller. The question is, when will the recording be available? As soon as we close this webinar, there's just some time for the technology to download and transcribe and make that public. But I would say latest by tomorrow, that should be in your inbox, and it would just be a link to the recording that you can view. And for those who are interested in using those tools, there are already pre-recorded, I think it's, Lee, was it 20 to 30 minutes or so on the program tool and on the property tools.
That's right.
Yeah, and so those again are linked into this slide deck, and you'll be able to click through to those tools. And again, that'll all be in your inbox shortly.
And those tools are available at scalecollaborative.ca as well. There's a blog post, the most recent blog post on scalecollaborative.ca references today's session with all of the links as well.
Fantastic. I'm unable to change my screen and get that link, but it will certainly be in the email again.
Thank you, Tina. That it is one of the areas, I think, in which especially smaller nonprofits struggle. I find that as organizations grow beyond a few million in revenues, and maybe depending on the nature of the organization, even earlier than that, but it's some time before they can actually afford to have the proper decision support in-house. And so then also, depending on the skill and background of the executive director and or the board members, there may be a reluctance to spend what seems like astronomical sums on getting professional accounting or legal advice And so then that stands in the way of change, and or leads to mistakes, which can also be extremely costly. She's nodding emphatically. I love it. So hopefully after you view the other webinars, if you view them, Tina, there's something that you can share maybe with your folks as well. Thanks very much.
Tina, not to put you on the spot, but if you feel it's appropriate, feel free to share your email address in case folks might want to contact you as well. Okay, well, we're coming up to the top of the hour. If there's any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type your question in the chat box. Otherwise, if you do have to drop off now, thank you so much for joining us again. I hope this was helpful and will be useful going forward as you think about your own rebuild strategies. Stay safe and hopefully you keep managing well. And we will be in touch via email with all of these follow-up items. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. And thank you, Lee.